maybe we throw out the ones that are going to go bad, but the ones that aren't, that just kind of look like they might go bad, we might actually be able to sell those more effectively, and that can actually reduce some of our numbers too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Literacy in all these different domains. Understanding agriculture, literacy, understanding the systems in your community, in your country, understanding, having literacy about the media which you use. All these different domains. We all have to take a lot of development and a lot of investments. It's a long struggle, but it's like, yeah, exactly. These platforms are exactly what it's about. It's about getting out these stories and normalizing these ideas, which don't normally get a lot of mainstream attention.
Right.
Hello and welcome to Talk Ag to Me, the podcast dedicated to improving ag literacy around the globe. I'm your host, Brendan Black, and in today's episode, we are talking to another guest of ours named Samboi. We had a great conversation about all kinds of things regarding agriculture, the environment, food waste, and just society as a whole and how it's impacted by our food supply. Now, unfortunately, this episode has a bit of a weird audio quality issue going on. We recorded on Skype, and I have had issues with Skype in the past, and I didn't realize until after the recording that Skype also didn't save my mic settings, so it uses my default mic instead of my actual mic, which made it sound really weird. We were having some connection issues. He came across really quiet. It was just kind of a weird situation, so bear with me. We almost re-recorded it, but I liked the conversation so much I wanted to keep it as it was. So I really hope you guys enjoy it, and if you have any more questions about anything that we talked about in this episode, be sure to let me know. But I thought it was a really fun one, and I hope you guys enjoy it. So thank you so much, and go check out Samboi. I'll have him plug all of his stuff at the very end, and I'll put it down in the description so you guys can check it out. And without further ado, here's the conversation.
Basically, what I was saying is that I just appreciate the fact that discovering your work. And it's a shame that food and agriculture, despite it being such an important facet of our lives, is something that really just kind of exists as a backdrop, except when it comes to emergency.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's exactly, that's the whole message that we're trying to push here is that, agriculture is much more important than it's getting credit for, and that it needs to be more of a mainstream topic that gets talked about a lot more than it really is. And so I'm glad that you came to that conclusion, on your own, even without my content.
Oh yeah, man. So starting off, I go by the name Samboi or El Samboi. It's All Relative podcast, and I discuss news and culture and whatnot, art, media, politics, all that. And while most people, I'm sure, would very much say that I'm left-leaning, progressive, I try to take in as many different perspectives on an issue before I give my final.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm definitely in a similar boat, except a little bit more on the other side of things. But I tend to be very open to at least hearing, and considering what other people have to say on different matters, and trying to get as many different perspectives as possible. Because that's kind of a policy with my show too, is that no one's a true expert, because everyone knows something that somebody else doesn't know, and so it's worth hearing everyone's thoughts on the matter before you make your final verdict on it. And even when you do, there's agriculture, just as an example, is a constantly evolving science, and so it's worth always reconsidering that maybe what you once knew isn't exactly true anymore, and that seems to be the case with a lot of different things in the world. So I'm glad that we can come to that agreement at least.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know when we first reached out to one another, I had to make sure and double back and make sure that talk about the things that I wanted to focus on is 3 elements of food and agriculture, which is food waste, technology, and food activism, and I guess you could say laws, how the justice system and law enforcement.
Those are great topics to cover in agriculture. Those are all aspects of agriculture that often get overlooked. People tend to think of agriculture as very simplistic lifestyle, very rural, just kind of living out on your farm. You have like a cow in a cornfield and that's about all agriculture is. It's definitely a lot more expansive now. And like you mentioned, there's a lot more to it in terms of technology and legislature and, all these different aspects of agriculture. So I'm glad that, we can, kind of get into some of that stuff too. So yeah, I'm all for it. Any questions you have, I'll answer with full honesty. I have a full transparency policy on this podcast. So anything that you are curious about, then I'll be sure to answer to the best of my ability.
So I guess before I start getting into angles I wanted to explore, because I know you said that you'll have on people with different ranges of expertise or different levels of knowledge and whatnot. What is your background or relation to this? Is it just a pet issue, something you've always cared about, or is it something that you in those fields, or what is your proximity to agriculture?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I started out, so I'm 21 years old, or about to turn 21. I'll be 21 in 2 months. I was born and raised in Tulare, California, which is right in the smack dab center of California. And we call it Cowtown because it's basically just a dairy central. Like everywhere you go, there's dairies. I mean, you can't turn a corner without, either seeing or at least smelling a dairy. So I just grew up around agriculture my entire life, and it was never really something that I cared that much about. But I always a lot of my family friends were farmers. My dad worked in agriculture most of his life and continues to work in agriculture. My sister and brother both worked in agriculture their entire lives and continue to work in agriculture. And so it was something that always kind of surrounded me, but it wasn't something that really piqued my interest. And then when I got into high school, I got involved in a youth leadership organization called FFA. And I'm not sure if you've heard of FFA, if you're familiar with the organization at all. Okay. So FFA stands for the Future Farmers of America. And basically it's a youth leadership organization focused on developing skills like leadership-based skills like public speaking, job interview kind of stuff, like team leading, project management, time management, like personal responsibility, all that kind of stuff, like stuff that typically isn't taught in school. FFA focuses on those skills, skills that can help you get a job and be a productive, society member as you, progress through life. And they teach all of you this with agriculture as a roots to all the lessons. So like, for example, I learned how to do all my public speaking by speaking about agricultural issues. And I learned how to do my job interview skills by applying to agricultural jobs and practicing with those jobs as backgrounds. I actually had a class, there was a biology class, but it was agricultural biology. So we learned about biology from the perspective of the farm. We learned about animal biology by looking at cows, and we learned about plant biology by looking at corn. And so it wasn't, it wasn't like it was vastly different than what we were learning in regular classrooms, but there was more of a practical element to it because it was more of, this typically when we think of school, a lot of the lessons we learn are conceptual. So you have calculus and you have advanced physics and all these different topics that are really interesting and complicated, but typically students have a hard time applying them to the real world. They have a hard time finding practical applications. You'll hear all the time, that's actually kind of a common joke now is, when am I ever going to use this in life? And you have some students actually stop trying in certain classes because they don't see a value in that class in their future career. That was an advantage that agriculture had in a lot of its educational programs, was that it had a practical grounds to everything it taught. It wasn't just, this is a concept that is never going to apply to your life. This is your food, and this is exactly how we're growing it. And all these topics, all these skills apply to the growth of your food and something that you rely on every day. So that was kind of what really kind of dug me into it, was that not just that I grew up around it, but there was a practical application to the knowledge I was learning, and that I was actually able to use it for something productive. And especially because I grew up in an ag town, I was already surrounded by it, so I could apply it to things that I actually saw, in my backyard. And so that kind of stuff was really got me into it. And as I learned more about the issues behind it and the lack of awareness that people have about agriculture, I had a lot of my teachers really influence me to become an agriculture teacher myself. And so that was kind of where that path started on to, becoming the podcast and me studying agricultural education and going on to teaching others about agriculture and all that. So I guess you could say that's kind of the roots of where all this started, was when I was in high school learning about all these issues and kind of speaking on them, and it just kind of grew from there.
Oh, that's incredible, dude. And I love that. And especially you saying that you're only old. It takes a long time for age. I'm going to be 32 next month. And, even though I have been interested in these topics and whatnot since, say I was 12, 13 years old, it takes stages, it takes years to accumulate the experiences and the knowledge and then also just getting to the guts to actually get out there and, organize or actually participate in the organization, in these systems a lot of people oftentimes get stuck at the stage of theorizing or focusing on the conceptual stuff, and just smelling their own farts all day. Like-minded people. So that's incredible. That's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
So getting into the topics, I would say that as far as my foray into understanding food and agriculture specifically, around the teenage years, a lot of people started getting seriously into whatever they get into, and that was the time I started getting into politics. And I got my first job at a In-N-Out Burger. I don't know how close they are into Central California, but I stay in Southern. I'm from Southern California, around Los Angeles.
Okay.
So they're all over the damn place. And, first job, and so I'd go, we'd go to the restaurants and done all this stuff before. It wasn't until then that I started to really understand food. Because, of course, you're getting all these different, meats, and produce, and poultry and all this stuff. And naturally, the question comes about, well, if we're only supposed to keep a certain amount of things for a certain amount of time, even with all the refrigeration and whatnot, then what do we do with the rest of this stuff? And it's just like you're just throwing you just see hundreds, thousands, sometimes thousands of dollars worth of food trash. So then the next question starts coming up naturally. Hey, why can't we just give this food to the people who are obviously starving, or even people who we know are working that are struggling to put food on the table consistently? And start to hear all these things about, liability from foodborne illnesses, want anybody to sue us and whatnot, have too much attention. And really what it comes down to is that, while part of it does come from that fear of liability and everything, somebody who is starving, for the most part, isn't going to turn away a good hot meal. Yeah, they'll be, upset if things don't go right, but preserving food and preparing it right really isn't the most difficult thing in the world. There's just a lot of stigmas around not giving people free stuff, even people feeling like if they didn't work for it, then they didn't, deserve it, even though we already pay into the system in so many different ways and don't get, saying the full value of our investment, you could say. And that was kind of like the first, instance when I was seeing these. And, to give you some numbers, it's estimated that food waste around the world is between 25 and 33%. So that means at different stages of production and distribution and whatnot and consumption, a good fourth to a third of all food that's manufactured in the world is destroyed. Unfortunately, I didn't get any official numbers on how many people go homeless, how many people go hungry. But in the United States, it's estimated that around 1/6 to 1/5 of all households don't have consistent food consumption. Whether it's living in a desert or just not having the finances and whatnot. And you could say that once you start compiling these bits of information together, it really makes you start to question and get really more agitated with the system and the laws as they are. You start to realize that there are certain laws in place that really shouldn't be there, or there's even something called the 1996 Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Law, which protects restaurants from the liability from criminal and civil litigation. And you start learning again about like the cultural stigma and about people being leeches and things in the system and whatnot. So that was kind of like my initial stages of coming to understand the issue and just how pervasive it is. Did you have any something to say on that part?
Yeah, I just want to make sure you were finished. I don't want to interrupt you. But yeah, so I think so before I get into that, because I do have quite a few thoughts on that issue, and it's definitely you have some really good points. I want to address them. Before I get into that though, so is working in fast food your first experience with agriculture, or do you kind of throwing the question back to you? Do you have any background or experience in agriculture prior to to your experience with the food waste issue you were talking about?
Oh no, not at all.
Okay.
Yeah, not just besides being a regular consumer. I think maybe we've gone to farms a couple of times, whatnot. I think that was about it.
Okay, yeah, no, that's perfectly fine. I just want to make sure because I always like to gauge where my guests are at in terms of their agricultural literacy, so that way if I know if I talk about certain topics that they're going to understand, or if I'm going to have to break it down, just to make sure I don't want to speak over your head, but I also don't want to talk down to you. So I want to have a good gauge of where your knowledge set is at. So in terms of the food waste, just to throw a couple more numbers at onto your plate that you already mentioned. The food waste in the United States alone is about 40%, which is pretty huge considering how much food and how many people we have in this country. And the United States is one of the worst countries about food waste, but we also have one of the lowest rates of just for example, like the amount of disposable income that we use on food is such a low percentage in the United States compared to other countries that we almost have the luxury of being able to waste food. Like in other countries, they may spend 50 to 60 to 75% of their income on food. We spend, like, I don't remember what the exact numbers are, but I think it's like less than 5% of our income on food. Like, we spend so little on food compared to what we spend on other things that we almost have the luxury of being able to waste food, which isn't a good luxury to have, obviously, because there are still some people in the United States who can't afford that, or who don't have access to it because of one reason or another. Like you mentioned, food deserts is a thing that happens, or sometimes it's the way the income works in certain areas of the country or whatever it is. But the issue of food waste is one that we've been trying to figure out for a while, especially from the agricultural sector. Because on the agricultural side of things, we don't like food being wasted either. A lot of the time, the food gets wasted on the farm because usually most of the food waste happens at the consumer level. Usually it's at the restaurant or it's at the actual consumer's plate, and they throw away leftovers, or they let's just say like some meat goes bad, or if it's been refrigerated, it hasn't been refrigerated for long enough, or it's whatever the case may be, and you throw it out. A lot of that happens on the consumer level. On the agricultural level, we try to minimize waste as much as possible. It still happens. I'm not going to lie and say that it doesn't happen. A lot of the waste that happens on the agricultural level, though, tends to happen from the perspective of the consumers aren't going to buy this, so I'm going to throw it out. That's typically the mindset that goes into it. Like they might be, so like just for example, oranges. You'll see a lot of oranges in stores that don't have any scratches, any bumps, any bruises on them. Typically, that's because they get thrown out before they even reach that point, because people are scared that consumers aren't going to buy them. Those oranges may not be they may not have anything wrong with them. So I work in a grocery store, and every day I go through and look at our oranges, and I look through and find the ones that have the bumps and the scratches and the bruises, and I leave those there. I just find the ones that have what we call blemishes, that are they're so bad that the fruit's going to rot like tomorrow, basically. I'll find stuff that has like sunburns on it, or it has split skin, or it has like punctures all over it, like whatever. If it's fruit that's not going to be good, I'll throw that out. But everything else, if I have a customer that doesn't want to buy a fruit because it has a mark on it, I'd be sure to explain to them, like, hey, this mark isn't a bad thing. It means that the insect was biting right here and it didn't pierce through the skin, which is actually a good thing, because that means the insect probably thought this was a healthy piece of fruit. So you should probably, it probably tastes better, honestly. Like, I actually personally try to buy the fruit that does have a lot of marks on it, because it usually means it tastes better. But that's a thing that we've kind of bred into our society, is like this consumerist. We're very cosmetic based with our consumerism. We like things that look good, not necessarily things that taste good or are good for us. And so you'll see a lot of food waste happening with food that just doesn't look good. It may not have anything wrong with it, but it just doesn't look how the consumer wants it to look. And so that causes a lot of food waste as well. So I think that part of the issue is with, agricultural literacy, with education, with kind of, helping create this stigma of, not all food that looks bad is bad for you. You need to kind of get, like, just getting people out of that mindset will help fix some of it. But on the side of it that you're talking about, the side of it where, the food that we're already wasting, why can't we give that to, lower income families or homeless people or people who can't afford it, or, whatever? I honestly don't see a problem with that. Obviously the liability issue is one that people like to bring up a lot, but like you mentioned, there's legislation that protects, it protects people in restaurants and producers from getting hurt from that situation. And like you mentioned, families that are that hungry aren't going to care. They're gonna go for either way, because it's either they get sick or they die. Like they're gonna have to pick one. And so you'll see a lot of that. I personally can't really tell you why we're not getting more wasted food to those families. I'd be all for that. I just think that there needs to be some kind of better infrastructure for being able to distribute it, because a lot of the time what happens is, if you have a bunch of free food and you just say come take it, then one person will take it all and nobody else will have any. So you need to have some kind of better distribution method of getting that food out there. I think that's part of the issue, is that just nobody wants to put in the effort to have the distribution method established. And another part of it, and this is the part that I can somewhat understand, but I also see the other side of is that people are fearful that, obviously giving away free food is going to de-incentivize working. I don't necessarily see that to be the case as much as some people argue it is. I think that it can be. Like, I don't think that, personally, I personally don't believe that everyone needs to have free food all the time. I think that those who can't work or who are working but aren't making enough, they need some kind of help because obviously, there's always like the argument that we have a right to food. I personally say that we have a right to life and that food is necessary for life. And so that not necessarily that we have a right to food, but more that we have a right to means of obtaining things that will keep us alive. And so if we have a right to the things that are helping us stay alive and we're still not getting them, that's where the issue starts to come in. So I think that not necessarily providing free food to everyone is the answer. I think that having some kind of a way of still incentivizing work, but still making sure that those families don't go hungry every night, and making sure that there's enough food for everyone to go around, and making sure that there's enough food that's not going to get stolen or go bad or cause people to get sick. So at the end of the day, like, we're not, we don't want to give our rotten cheese to this family that's going hungry, because at the end of the day, we still don't want them to get sick. We still don't want them to die. We still have to be careful with our food safety procedures because the United States prides itself in being the safest food supply in the world, and it is. But there still needs to be some level of control in how we regulate the food that's wasted and the food that we shouldn't be wasting that we could put somewhere else. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are kind of my thoughts on the matter.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was just a question. I just wanted to, get your feedback on that point. It's bulldozed through the. I have a tendency, I've noticed sometimes, because I'm used to rambling for like 90 minutes by myself on my own cast, so I just want to make sure I didn't do that.
Oh yeah.
But no, but it's like I like those points. I fully, agree with them, and that, there's that other side of, the consumerist angle and people's obsession with, cosmetic thing and concern over blemishes. Mm-hmm. Because even myself, what I'm saying is I try to be, more conscious than the average person. It's like I can go into my fridge right now with the fruits and vegetables that I just picked out, and I picked, the prettiest ones that I could find. It's like,
yeah.
So it's like that's definitely a factor. As a matter of fact, have you heard of a company called I think it's called Ugly Produce? Mm-hmm. So I don't know if it's a nonprofit or just like a small operation or whatnot, but basically what they do is that all those fruits and vegetables or produce, like you mentioned, that have blemishes or that seem unsightly, they get them, and to those whom want them, you can hit them up, and I don't, pay a smaller fee, and they will deliver to you some of these vegetables and fruits and whatnot that are, fully, good to eat, but that get discarded before they even hit the shelves at grocery stores, retailers and whatnot. I don't know how prevalent they are. I've only heard about them in the LA area, as I know.
Interesting. Yeah, I've never heard of them. That's actually a really interesting concept, though. If we can get more stuff like that going, or at least more, some kind of like education program to get the word out there that I don't have the answers on how to actually implement it, but if we could find a way to push that, that idea that ugly food is not bad for you thing, that like. Just because a banana's got a little bit of brown on it doesn't mean you're gonna die, or that if an orange has a scratch on it, it's not gonna make you sick. Like if we could have some kind of way of pushing some of that kind of stuff more effectively, then that'd be great. I mean, that's kind of what I'm trying to do with the podcast is to try to get more of a conversation about this kind of stuff happening in general. And so maybe that's the place to start, is just trying to have more conversations, trying to get more engagement, and that's what I mean. I try to do that everywhere I can. I teach my customers that I teach, about fruit and about food, and trying to teach people that just because this looks funny doesn't mean it's bad. Don't throw it out just yet. That kind of stuff. And if you teach, if you explain that kind of stuff to someone, they understand it and they actually appreciate it. But it's just for some reason, in the heat of the moment, just buying food and just going, our brain almost shuts off, and we're just like, oh, that one looks pretty, I'll grab that one, instead of actually taking the time to think about, okay, well, maybe I should try to buy the ones that aren't as pretty, just because if I don't, they might get thrown out. And as we start to move towards that, we might actually move to a place where we don't throw out the ones before they hit the shelf after all. Maybe we throw out the ones that are going to go bad, but the ones that aren't, that just kind of look like they might go bad, we might actually be able to sell those more effectively, and that could actually reduce some of our numbers too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. literacy in all these different domains, literacy in understanding food and agriculture, literacy in understanding, the systems in your community and your country, understanding, having literacy about the media which you consume. All these different domains, we all have to take a lot of development and a lot of investments So it's a long struggle, but it's like, yeah, exactly. These platforms are exactly what it's about. It's about getting out these stories and normalizing these ideas, which don't normally get a lot of mainstream attention.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that there's another point in the food waste conversation that you didn't exactly hit on it because I wasn't sure if you were trying to go more domestic or broad range, but another point that people often bring up with the food waste conversation is obviously, there's like the whole issue of like trying to solve world hunger. And you have all these countries full of people who are spent, like I mentioned, like, 50 to 75% of their income on food alone, and half the time they don't even get enough. And you have like, developing countries that their citizens are not just starving but malnourished. They may be getting enough food, but they're not getting enough nutrition to keep themselves sustained and that kind of stuff. There's reasons why we can't get them food as much. I mean, there's still ways that we can help, but there's reasons why we can't just give them all of our like. There's always like the complaint of like, like when you were younger, your mom might have said like, if you don't like if you don't eat that, somebody is starving in Africa, they'd love to have that. Why don't you give it to them? It's like, well, it's not that simple. There's reasons why we can't just give them food, and I wanted to bring that up just because, in case anyone's listening that has that question of like, well, why don't we just give it to the people who are starving in other countries? It's like, well, we could, but there's a lot of issues with the trade regulations between these countries. There's a lot of issues with the public relations between these countries. Like, it's not as simple as we can just drop a crate in one of these developing countries and feed a family or feed a whole village. Like, if we tried that, we might get shot down because there's heavy amounts of governmental control in some of these developing countries that are causing a lot of trouble for these citizens to be able to get up and be able to get some of these resources. And that causes a lot of issues for us to be able to get resources to them. Like, we may want to give them all of our wasted food, but because of the way our trade regulations are structured, and because of the way our relationships with those governments are structured, we literally can't get the food to them without either getting stopped at the border or without getting in some kind of trouble. We don't want to start a war with a country that you don't have any business getting into a war with.
Right.
So I don't know if you didn't bring that point up, but that's just something I like to address for the world, for the world hunger / food waste. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, yeah, you're good. No, but that's an excellent point. And there have been humanitarian efforts undertaken by the U.S. and plenty of other countries, forever. There's always been different efforts to try to, to do this with varying levels of success. And in addition to the reasons which you stated, which is, more of the relations between the heads of states, you also have the issue of that, in developing countries, part of the reason why they are developing is that they don't have, they have power vacuums. They don't have,
right.
They still have competing factions for heads of state or heads of communities and whatnot. So there's plenty of stories of examples of we do drop off a crate, right? Like, it lands where it's supposed to land and whatnot, and it will land in a place that is essentially disputed territory for the peoples that are living there. So you could just be a regular person. It's like, oh, let me go and get this pound of rice or this pound of beans and everything, and then you have like, say militia members coming to you from this side, telling you to give up the goods or whatever, and then you got like officials on this other side, so the smaller dynamics, the local dynamics of sometimes these places don't have those stable institutions and whatnot that allow for the distribution of these goods and services to the people that need them. In addition to those larger ones concerning geopolitics and international relations and whatnot.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's a big, that's a very important point too. And another thing on top of that point is, not only are they having a hard time establishing political infrastructures, they don't have technological infrastructures to be able to maintain that kind of society anyways. They don't necessarily have the same technological advancements that we have in terms of being able to maintain. I mean, that's a large reason why agriculture in those areas has a hard time sustaining itself anyways, is because they can't store water. They can't store food. They can't store feed for their half the time. Like, they had a really hard time maintaining a lot of their agricultural production and maintaining the food that we do give them, just because they don't have the technological infrastructure to maintain it. And like you said, a lot of that has to do with either power vacuums or just domestic disputes that are not really our business to regulate. And we're trying to prevent wars on the national scale, on the global scale, and on the domestic scale. We don't want them to have any civil wars because of something that we did. So there's a certain level of liability that we have to have for our involvement in these political, like these foreign affairs as well. So, like, that's a good point.
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes into the next strain of this conversation, which is food activism, or efforts that people make to provide, saying food for themselves or for others. I'm not sure I'm not sure how much you're on like social media, especially Twitter. But there's obviously a ton of activity and whatever going on there. Lots of different documentation, and one of the things that took place was in Portland, Oregon. There was an activist group that went by the name Riot Ribs, and essentially what it was is that I don't know if it was in downtown Portland or some other area. They basically established, I guess like you say, just like a public potluck or whatever. Right? So, people are cooking and preparing different foods and whatnot, and just giving it, serving up plates, saying to whoever's coming and getting it and whatnot, right? And I'm not sure about if there were any disputes about if they needed if they needed permission, if they needed to get a license to do that and whatnot. Overall, I see that as a positive thing. But unfortunately, the reaction to it was extremely negative. Portland is a city with a lot of political strife between left wing and right winger. I should say far left and far right reactions and whatnot. And being as this group activity was seen as being associated with left wingers, the far right will come through and ransack the shit and attack people and whatnot. Not saying that they were necessarily ones that always provoked it. But this thing that could have benefited anybody of any background that has come up and gets food, I think ultimately did a disservice overall. And then you also had incidents where the police will come through and not just shut down the food being made, but that they would pepper, like you've seen footage of them pepper spraying the food, making it inedible. So this really just sociopathic and just destructive, and just showing that they really are against people getting the basics of necessity, needs that they have to
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that you touched on a really good point, and that kind of ties into this idea that I've been working on about how food is kind of like the whole point of this podcast is that to kind of get the idea across that food should not be politicized. That food is if we can't agree on food, we can't agree on anything basically, because like food is like the one thing that we should be able to agree on because we all need it. And the amount of politicization that has gone into our food has just proven that we really can't be on the same grounds for anything for any particular reason. So it's kind of to your point, it's interesting to see that different political groups can't even agree on how food should be distributed, if food should be distributed in certain ways. And a lot of that might not have anything to do with the food itself. It might just be because those groups just don't like to see each other do anything semi-productive. And so it's difficult to say that one side just doesn't want people to have free food, and it might just be one side doesn't want the other person to be giving away free food. And so it's like it's hard to say where the line is on exactly the reasoning behind those actions. No matter what, they're wrong. No matter what, those things should be prevented, and we should have better ways of going about having those interactions with the like it's like the community potluck kind of stuff. Although that does make me think of the like back when they were having the I can't remember what it was called, the micro city inside Washington.
Chaz, the autonomous zone.
Yes. How like the first few days they had like a massive like stack of food for people to just take wherever whenever they needed it, and then homeless people came over and just took all of it at once, and like nobody had any food for like the entire time. Like that kind of stuff is usually the example I cite to whenever we go about talking about community food sources, because in theory that they're a good idea, but that they can have flaws. And so I think that in citing both of those instances, you can show that we need to have a better conversation about how to handle our food and how to distribute it properly. I think at the end of the day, it all goes back to infrastructure. Like if you have proper infrastructure to handle these kinds of things, then it makes it difficult for groups, whether they be homeless people or political activists or police, whoever it is. If you have proper infrastructure to have effective distribution, then it makes it more difficult to shut those kinds of things down. And so I think that a lot of what goes into making those kinds of events successful is just planning, infrastructure, having some kind of support from local like community members that can actually benefit from from like maybe getting like the city council on board with it, or getting like your mayor on board with it, which I know is a difficult thing to do, but like having that kind of support can make it easier to get that kind of stuff done. So And that's not to say that those people were in the wrong for trying to do something without permission, basically. But like I think that we're not in a good place to go about having those kinds of interactions happen until we figure out a better way to have the conversation about whether or not they should happen and how we should go about doing them if we are going to do them at all. So I don't know. It's kind of a difficult, that's a difficult place to go because like I said, food is just it's such a useful and important thing to have. It's just like anytime we talk about it, it's like, well, we should be all on board for this, but it's like every time we talk about it, we end up getting on the wrong page for things. So I I don't really know what the right answer is to how we should about talking about this.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's, I tend not to think that there's one final, answer because like you said, while I agree that, infrastructure is obviously a key component, we also acknowledge that, the literacy and the cultural, leanings, or I guess you could say the beliefs and whatnot are important as well. Because you could have the infrastructure there, but if you have a bunch of people operating within or outside of it who don't share those same inclinations, then the infrastructure can, also fall apart or just, lose its integrity. And that's, plenty of, we see that as well. And one thing that I will say is that one of the critiques that I have of my peers on the left, especially those who call themselves anarchists, is they shun hierarchy and infrastructure to the detriment of the movement. Because as you said, you have this thing. It sounds nice, but when you just say, "Oh, we have a pallet of food," and you're just like, and because what the assumption is, "Oh, everybody's going to be reasonable and considerate of those around them," you're not thinking about the fact that if you've been starving and you've been on the streets or something like that, you have that I forget the exact term, but you have a starvation mindset or whatever. You're like, "Oh, I may not be able to get food for tomorrow," so naturally you're going to go and get saying 3 or 4 saying worth of supplies when you only got 1 or 2. And that's where being too lax in terms of establishing hierarchies and embracing infrastructure, so there's it's a multifaceted issue and there's no one singular answer. It's more like we have to hit different angles from internally as well as externally, because they have to be it has to be like a circuit. They have to be reinforcing one another and feeding off one another.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right, and that's solid point. And I think that you definitely have hit the nail right on the head. And there's like you said, there's just a lot of different moving pieces that need to be accounted for whenever we're going about doing these kinds of things. And I also think it's interesting to talk about the difference in place that when we talk about food, we talk about very different sides of the food chain. So like typically when we talk about world hunger or like homeless people not having access to food or low income families not having access to food or food waste or any of that kind of stuff, typically we think of food as its final product. We tend not think about food on the production side of things, where really that might be where we're missing the mark a little bit. And that's not just because I'm an agriculturalist, but there's a lot of small scale farmers that really enjoy helping the community and have no problem getting food to people who need it. And so I think that there's a lot to be said about like we mentioned with the literacy thing and having a conversation about the food itself and what it goes through to get to where it is. There's a lot to be said about how the food is grown too. Like that literacy can't just take place in what is on the shelf, but also how to get to the shelf. Literacy has to start with at what point was it put in the ground, what happened to it while it was in the ground, and then what happened to it every step of the way until it got to your plate. And so that's I think part of the reason why a lot of these things are kind of getting misconstrued is because people aren't thinking of food as what food is. They're thinking of it more as almost like a symbol of value or a symbol of wealth, and that kind of creates some false or not necessarily false, but it creates like tension between different groups because they see food as a power symbol when really like food is like I've been saying the whole time, food should be a unifying thing, not a dividing thing. And so like, I think that what I try to do on this podcast all the time is just try to bring more attention to the agricultural side of things. I think that having more conversations about where the food comes from and what goes into it and what the farmers do for it and all that kind of stuff could be beneficial to not just the people who are consuming the food, but the people who are trying to distribute that food too. Because like I mentioned, I actually know quite a few local farmers. So right now I'm living in Fresno. I'm a little bit about an hour north of where I usually like where I'm from. We do have an In-N-Out here. We have an In-N-Out in Visalia too, which is right next to my hometown. But we have local farmers that are small scale farmers, and they are I can't remember what exactly the term is, but basically they run their operation where they, like, let's just say, actually I know one that's it's a hog operation. So they have their hogs, they have like all of their swine or whatever. They don't butcher them and send them off to be packaged and off to the store. They butcher them all in their same operation, and they sell them at their doorstep. So people can come in and they can actually pick a pig, and actually that's what their website is called, Pick a Pig, and they can go through the entire like operation, see what they do, see how the whole slaughter process works, see how clean it is, all the processes they go through, and then they get to buy the meat at the end of the day. So like having that level of interaction with the farmer is also it's cheaper, it's safer because you know exactly where it's coming from and what went into it, and not only that, it can be a much more beneficial from a community level, a much more beneficial source of food for everyone involved. So like that, I actually know that those people sell to lower income families, certain just because those lower income families can't afford it in the store, so they go to to the local farmer. Local farmer can get them their healthy source of meat and vegetables and stuff like that for a lower price. So like having more community involvement with agriculturalists can be very beneficial to this exact issue that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's like a farmer's. That's more of like the idea of like not necessarily farmers markets, but I mean that's more like vertical integration where everything they handle everything from top to bottom. But that idea of that the people who are making it are able to engage with the community, engage with the businesses one-on-one instead of having to go through all these middlemen. And a point that I'm sure you'll be able to espouse on more because I don't have hard numbers in front, but companies like corporations, I should say, like Monsanto, their reputation and their presence has become only more pronounced over decades. And while there have been plenty more documentaries, they've also come to monopolize the market of food technology. And like I said, even though I don't have hard numbers, it was amazing to me that, being somebody who was raised primarily around different, urban centers and whatnot, metropolitan areas, to have this stereotype in my mind that like, oh, all these farmers are just, undereducated or they're all poor and whatnot, and realizing that no, that in order to be a farmer, especially as it is today, last several decades, you have to be well educated. You have to have a lot of different skills to be able to handle all the different components of the business. But then the other issue is that once you start to get to a certain level, you have to go play ball with corporations like Monsanto, and then that comes with quotas. That comes with having to respect their intellectual property. They have those Terminator seeds. There's been different legal battles concerning that over the years, and I don't know where it stands at this moment. But just the idea that you have to buy seeds to produce food that only that are only good for one use, and they're done, and that's to maintain the wealth of the patent that the corporation holds. So I think this is maybe something that you could probably espouse on a little bit more. Is there, other numbers or other legislation, of, or other, figures in the game that come to mind concerning this angle?
Yeah, definitely. And so that's probably one of the biggest aspects of the agricultural, like that's basically where agriculture comes into the mainstream conversations. Like after all the people I've talked to on this podcast about agriculture, their number one question every single time is big farming versus small farming. What's the deal? And that's always a common question because people always want to support, the local small farmers, which is great. I think that's perfectly fine. That's always, a good thing. And coming from a small farm town, that's something that I'm fully on board with. I think that there are definitely some truths to the things people are fearful of when it comes to corporate farmer. There's definitely some misconception coming in. It was kind of the one that's in hot water right now, and I don't know the current position on all the legislative battles. I just know there's a bunch of them. But Monsanto's in trouble for a bunch of different things. I mean, like not just they're in trouble for quite a few things. And I actually know that Monsanto as a company disbanded, and so they disbanded into several smaller companies that all are still run by the same people, but they have different names now, so that they can continue their practices basically without getting sued to the ground. And so that kind of stuff happens quite a bit because agriculture is not supposed to be monopolized, and that's kind of like most companies, most industries aren't supposed to be monopolized. Like I don't think there's any industry that's built around being monopolized. But agriculture is one that you really have a hard time monopolizing, because if you do, it starts to cause really big issues for you. And that's something that I think everyone pretty much universally agrees on, except for like large scale CEOs that don't really have as much consideration for the smaller farmers. But those you'll find are kind of few and far in between in the agriculture sector, because agricultural CEOs are different than like your average business CEO. And the reason for that is because typical agricultural corporations are often LLCs, which I don't know how much you know about business, but LLCs are conglomerate organizations. They're not so much massive companies that own a bunch of smaller companies. It's more so it's like one hub that a bunch of companies feed into. So it's like the smaller companies control the larger one, not the other way around. And so basically agriculture has designed itself that way to benefit smaller farmers. They try to do that so that way you don't have to corporatize to be able to compete in the markets. Sometimes they still do, and that's why we're seeing the amount of small farms dying out and the amount of larger farms increasing, is because most small farms are actually getting bought out by larger farms. But the misconception starts to come in when people think that those larger farms are what people like to call factory farms. I personally don't believe that factory farming is an actual thing, at least not the way people tend to think of it. Factory farming is a kind of a weird term that gets thrown around a lot that doesn't exactly have a definitive definition, because people tend to change it a lot. But the way that people define factory farming and corporate farming, they tend to be kind of similar. So people tend to think of factory farming as corporate farming, or rather, the other way around. They tend to think of what they think is factory farming is actually corporate farming. Is probably a better way to say that. But really, at the end of the day, corporate farming is in the small minority of farms. 98% of American farms are actually family owned, and they may be considered large farms or corporate farms, but they are family owned farms that are still somewhat small operations. They may be large in size, but they're small in staff. The actual people who are running it are the same people that have been running it for generations. It's not like it's not like it's 100 different like CEOs that are all like faceless, and you'll never know who they are. If you buy your product from a specific farm, you'll know exactly who the farmer is, who his wife is, who his kids are, because like the farmers take a lot of pride in their work, and they like to be known. And so the fear of like corporate farming tends to kind of get rid of that idea that family farms can be corporate too. They corporatize for business reasons, not for size reasons, although usually size has something to do with it. But that's kind of a tangent off on another thing. But going back to the Monsanto issue, going back to the legislative battles and all that kind of stuff, and the issue with large corporate farming, agriculturalists are trying to avoid that kind of thing too. They don't want Monsantos. They don't want massive corporations that are obviously taking over all. Like you said, there's the intellectual property issue that comes into play. There's like John Deere. I actually just found out about this recently. Apparently, John Deere had this massive like lawsuit issue with a farmer who like rented a tractor from them or bought a tractor from them or something like that. And I think he was renting the tractor first, and then when he was using it, one of the discs on it broke, and so he replaced it with his own disc, because he like kept calling them, they didn't answer, they wouldn't come out and help him, so he replaced it with his own disc. And when he returned it, John Deere sued him for changing something on their tractor. And so he actually ended up winning the lawsuit, and he had to buy the tractor, but he got the money for it too, because he was in the right, because they didn't they refused to help him even though he asked for it, and so he did it himself, and he got in trouble for it. So he won the lawsuit. But that kind of stuff is stuff that hurts the small farmer at the end of the day, because they don't always win those. They like, you have farmers that get sued for stupid things. I mean, farmers get sued for some ridiculous stuff. Like, you'd be surprised the kind of stuff that farmers get sued for. And a lot of times they lose, and they lose their farms because of it, because they can't afford those those prices. And so you'll see legal battles are becoming an ever increasing issue in the agricultural world. You'll see a lot of small farmers that struggle to maintain just because they can't keep up with the legality of everything. Mostly because of overregulation. Overregulation is a big part of it, but also because of lawsuits and other things involved. But the legal world of agriculture is one that didn't used to be that big of a deal. Now it's one of the largest aspects of the agricultural world. It's getting to a point where agricultural law, like if you were like to go to college and study agricultural law, that's becoming one of the more popular agricultural majors, besides agricultural business and like veterinary medicine. But like those are like the top three right there. It's like ag law, ag business, and vet, vet med. But it's like the idea that much, and agricultural technology is up there too. But agricultural technology is kind of like on its own. Like that's not really. It's considered an ag major, but it's more of like a technological engineering major. Um, and so that's kind of why it's off on its own. Like it's considered like agricultural sciences and technology, but it's kind of not considered part of that.
Right.
It's like
also under considered umbrella, a different umbrella.
right, exactly. And what's funny about it is like I've actually talked to people on here before that have designed like they're computer scientists that are not from agricultural backgrounds at all, and they've designed computers for agricultural facilities, or they've designed GPSs for tractors. They've designed drones or artificial intelligence systems that are used in agricultural operations, and they don't realize that their job is an agricultural job, that they are agriculturalists by trade, and they are connected through a different part of the industry than they typically think of. And so it's funny to me that like agriculture is so expansive, and yet people tend to forget that their job kind of ties into agriculture too a lot of the time. And so that again, that's I get on way too many tangents. I don't
No,
know.
that's great. I mean, that's a lot, but but the thing is, that's the nature of the subject, and that's the nature of life.
Right.
Life naturally flows in all these different, crisscrossing, intersecting patterns and whatnot. So no, I love the fact that we're having this back and forth like this.
But yeah, so that's you're absolutely right. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, you good. It was lagging a little bit there for a second.
Okay. I was just gonna say like that's kind of that's exactly how I mean that's just how agriculture is. Like there's just so many different paths you can go down, and there's so much expansion to it. It's so easy to get caught up in different tangents, stuff like that, and you almost like forget where you started. But going back to like the Monsanto and legislation issue, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add on to that, but I don't know if I answered your question. I probably got off on a little bit too far of a tangent, but hopefully I addressed some of the points you were looking for.
No, that was good. I was just asking, because that was one of my blind spots, understanding some of the legalese, behind food and agriculture. So no, you definitely filled that, in with a lot of insightful information.
Mm-hmm.
And then going off of that though into this is part legalese and part technology. So as food sources are becoming more disrupted, the population is increasing, climate change, whether it's, you're talking about man-made climate change or just natural occurrences and whatnot, they're changing. We're expecting a lot more migration, a lot of changing in the food, sources and whatnot. And so as a result, we started to see the rise of more artificial sweetener sources. We're also starting to see more lab-grown and 3D printed sources of meats. I've already seen examples, obviously, of beef and fish and poultry. What is your, what is your, concerns or thoughts on these emergent food technologies, the companies that are behind them, and then as naturally as different source or different companies compete and whatnot, some are going to fall off and some are going to, get bigger and grow and whatnot. What are your concerns going forward with these new technologies and how they're going to interface with how corporations, businesses are going to interface with governments and with the populace consumers?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good question, and it's a really tough one just because there's so many variables there. I mean, like there's just when it comes to science and technology, like you can't predict anything just because of how fast things change. My concerns. So I'll start with my concerns. My concerns are as we get into newer phases of agricultural technology, and we're going to continue to do that because, like you mentioned, we have lab grown meat now. We're seeing more artificial sweeteners and artificial just products in general. We're seeing a lot more artificial sources of different types of foods, and we're even seeing more supplemental diets. Which we can get into this later, but like plant-based diets are often supplemented by a variety of different nutrients that they can't get from entirely natural plant-based diets. So like we're seeing a wave of non-natural food. Like that's starting to become the new thing is our food is becoming less and less natural, ironically enough, because everyone wants it more natural. Now we're getting it less natural. But it's just that's consumerism for you. But I'm concerned about a couple of different things. My primary concern, and this is kind of tying into the lab grown meat thing, is that by the year 2050, they're estimating that our world population is going to jump from right now it's about 7.9 billion. It's supposed to jump up to about 9.8 billion by 2050. So we're going to be close to 10 billion people within the next 29, 30 years. And we're estimated to have to be able to grow. We're going to need about twice as much food, about like 50 to 70% more food than we have now, just to be able to sustain that much of a population. And that's on less land, with more regulations, with more environmental factors that we ever had, with, obviously newer technology, which is going to help, and also less people that are, presumably less people that are going to be as knowledgeable about how that food is grown, which in turn results in more regulations and more like difficulty in growing food. So like for example, the entirety of the organic market is based off of people not knowing much about agriculture. And that market, well, that's not the norm. We're not basing all of our food sources off of organic growing methods. Let's just assume, for example, that we get to a point where governments start banning non-organic methods of agriculture. We actually have seen similar things happen in smaller countries, like Sweden and Denmark and some of those, like more European countries. They've banned methods of growing agriculture that include pesticides, GMOs, like things that aren't used in organic agriculture. And as a result, like I actually talked to a Swedish farmer about this in person. Him and I were talking at this agricultural exposition that actually happens in my hometown. He was explaining to me that Sweden is almost entirely reliant on imports now because they can't grow food anymore. They've become so dependent on other countries to grow their food for them, just because they haven't necessarily made it illegal to use GMOs in their growing methods, but the general public is so against them, they're basically outlawed. And so it's not like that there's a law on the books that prevents it, but nobody's going to buy your product, so there's no point in growing it that way anyways. And there are actual countries who have banned GMOs and who have banned pesticides and antibiotics and other forms of what we consider green agriculture that come from the Green Revolution. That was a more recent revolution in agriculture. There's about 4 generations of agricultural revolutions. The green one's the third one. I'll get into that in a second because that's a whole other thing. But yeah, so I think that if we aren't careful with our literacy and with our education, we could get to a point like that eventually. I don't think the United States will for a while, but I think that other countries might, and that could be an issue because we feed a lot of other countries. So we may be fine. We may not have to grow entirely organic foods, but let's just say every other country in the world switches to organic and we have to feed them because they can't feed themselves off of how little land they have left. That's going to be an issue because organic food has been proven to not be able to grow as much as conventional methods of agriculture. There's actually studies that show that like genetically modified crops can grow up to 20% more yield than non-genetically modified crops, and that's in early phases. So like I think that the technology that's developing is really, really good, and it's going to be really beneficial. But if we're not careful with our education and literacy, we may get to a point where that technology doesn't matter anyways because nobody wants to use it. And so I'm fearful of that. I don't think that's ever going to happen, but that's just something that I like to be cognizant about, and that's kind of the whole driving purpose behind my advocacy of teaching others about agriculture, is because the more conversations we can have about this kind of stuff, the less likely it'll be that we'll ever get to the point where we have to basically succumb to what the consumers want and grow food that we can't sustain for long periods of time, and then we eventually run out of food. That's kind of like a floating concern. That's not like a primary, like that is a primary concern, but it's not a concern that I think is going to be one that's worth worrying about within the next 30 years. Over the next 30 years, the main thing that I'm worried about is lack of land. And as we lose land, it's really hard to get it back. Actually, it takes about 400 to 500 years to just grow a centimeter of topsoil. And if we build civilizations, if we build stores, if we build houses, if we build foundations, that destroys more than a centimeter of topsoil. So it's going to take us centuries to be able to regrow some of the stuff that we built our cities on. Not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm going to say the more that we do it, the less we're going to be able to grow back. So
right. Trade-offs.
Right. So
always a trade-off.
Yeah, it's not as simple as, okay, well, when we get to the point where we have 9 billion people and we have to grow more food, we'll just tear down some cities and we'll grow food. It's like, no, we can't do that. Like, it doesn't work like that. Exactly.
That's a brilliant point. And, that's one of the things which, when you talk to people who are, food or animal activists and whatnot, it's like, while you may say, yeah, you're making some great points and there is definitely a great moral argument, there's definitely a great environmental argument, all these things are correct, is that our whole existence is based on trade-offs. So as you said, it takes 400 to 500 years to develop that topsoil. And for so much of human history, we weren't using a lot of it. we just didn't have the technology. We weren't as saturated. Things weren't moving as fast. But within the last since industrialization around the world, the pace of growth and consumption and development has, far outstretched, thousands of years which preceded it. And so, when it comes to those issues of like having, extra land and stuff, people seem to not want to grapple with the fact that if you say, okay, we're going to focus more on building up more cities and everything and expanding in towns and shit like that. Okay, well, then you're trading off the ability, to have people in these different areas that are fulfilling different jobs, different tasks, such as working in agriculture and food and whatnot, and representing in those spaces. Or you just mess up the land in general. And so maybe in the case when you have an exodus from cities, when people want to leave metropolitan areas, they don't have anything else to go to, so they're kind of stuck. And then jumping off of that, the reason why I brought that up, the emergence of like different issues around technology and technology and the laws and whatnot, is so China. If anything, if the biggest lesson, if there's any one big lesson we can take from like the last decade amongst anything, is that the U.S. is no longer the bully in the playground that it used to be. It doesn't, there's plenty of other countries and nations and leaders who are showing that they can, tackle different causes sometimes more effectively and more efficiently. One of the things that China was doing, I don't know if it was just last year or 2019, is they sent up some plants, some seeds, whatnot, on a satellite. And I don't know if it was just orbiting around the Earth, around the moon or something like that. Yep. But it was the first successful attempt at growing seeds off of, I forget the exact term, but not growing seeds on the Earth.
Right.
So it kind of actually is a sign that one of the other emerging technologies is going to be growing foods and whatnot in outer space, or colonizing other planets and whatnot, other terrestrial bodies, for the sake of providing the foods for the growing population without having to make that trade-off of using up the topsoil on the Earth.
Yeah.
Which I think is really amazing. And of course, it's like, obviously we're talking about geopolitical relations and different, cultural instincts and whatnot, but just focusing on the scientific technology and whatnot, and the implications that it has for a country like China to be making such bold steps and developments, while other similar nations that are equally industrialized or have the same capabilities seem to be struggling with more lower concerns, or they're hemorrhaging their efforts, like you said, with getting so much caught up in this the green revolution and organic foods, when you can't embrace the fact that, this is hurting our food yields. And so then you have to focus on other things beyond research and development and keeping up with other competitors.
Right. No, absolutely. And you hit a perfect point right there. And that's actually where I was wanting to go next too, was the potential of growing food outside of Earth. And so that was something I've actually covered that in a couple episodes before. I did an episode on The Martian, the movie The Martian, and we talked about the potential of actually being able to grow food on Mars. And then I did another episode with somebody who actually worked on one of NASA's projects to be able to grow crops on the moon. And so that was really cool. We talked about that quite a bit. I think that we're going to start seeing stuff like that happen more and more often. I mean, we already talked about the lab-grown meat being a new technology that's going to start taking wave. I think that it will. I don't think the lab-grown meat will ever perfectly replace our conventional meat. I think that that's just something that's not going to happen. If it does, it's not going to be for a long time, just because it's going to be a while before we're going to be able to mass produce it to the scale we're going to need to. And people also aren't going to trust it for a while, I feel like. So that's one I'm not super worried about taking over. And even if it does, I really don't care. I mean, like I'm a diehard fan of classic beef. I was raised around beef and dairy farms my whole life, so it's like cattle are kind of my bread and butter. I literally this morning walked over to my school's beef ranch and hung out with the cows all day, just because that's where my happy place is. I just love cattle. But like, if it comes to the point where we have less cattle just because we can't have the land to feed them, and we have lab grown meat as a supplement to our meat supply, I think that's fine. One of the things that I'll get into, like the growing food outside of the planet thing in a second, but one of the things that's kind of a concern in the agricultural community right now is if we go into like lab grown meat and vertical farming and hydroponics and some of those other newer methods of growing food, that there's going to be less jobs for people, because agriculture employs so many people. They're going to lose, we're going to lose jobs as those kinds of methods start to show up. And my argument to that is always that there were less jobs for people whenever we invented the tractor. There were less jobs for people whenever we invented drones. There's like everything that we have ever done in terms of technological advancement took up jobs. But guess what? Invented more jobs. It just requires us as a society to evolve technologically and educationally. It just requires our workforce to get smarter and figure out new ways to do things, which we've been doing forever. I mean, the first time that they invented the tractor, the guy who used to push the plow, I guarantee he wasn't too happy about it. But as soon as he figured out how to drive a tractor, it probably made his life a whole lot easier. Like there's things that are going to take place of our traditional jobs, but they're going to create an evolution in the job market. It's not going to get rid of jobs. It's just going to create different jobs. And so that's something that I always provide as a counter argument to people always say like, well, if we create lab grown meat, that's just going to get rid of meat farmers. It's like, no, they're going to have to adapt, which they are very, very keen to. Farmers, if anything, are excellent at adapting to their environment. That's exactly what their job is just adapting to everything that's being thrown at them all the time, because it's a lot.
Yeah, it's ever evolving. And in a smaller case, a more consumer, small business case, is that you think of like grocery stores, right? And we're just surpassed a year of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States, and the impact we've seen on like restaurants and grocery stores, reporting a loss of revenue for not being able to serve customers indoors. But one of the things that's come about is that they say, oh, we can hire drivers, we can hire people to interface with different elements with the consumers and with our vendors and whatnot. You have to adapt. And no, it's not always going to be a one-to-one, like, oh, you lose 20 jobs and you're able to replace exactly 20 jobs. That's when other conversations about, okay, well, then how do we revolutionize other areas of our society to help spur, further growth, instead of just saying that, instead of just holding on to these old way of doing things just for the sake of, being stuck in our ways, and that's something that, again, has to happen, as you said, it has to be a push by education, getting people, the consumers, up to speed on this stuff. It has to be an effort by the governments in trying to streamline this and give people the resources and a consistent framework to work with. And then you also need corporations that are willing to play ball.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Go ahead.
No, that was it. If you want to keep going because you're looking up something, that's fine.
I'm looking at one number, so I want to make sure I get it right. But yeah, if you have more you want to add to that, then go right ahead. I just want to double check this.
No, that's it. I guess one other tangent to go off of that is one of the things that Andrew Yang helped to really popularize during his run in the Democratic primary, and that was brought up by other figures, which is, damn it, why did it slip out now? But is that you get a certain amount of guaranteed income. What's the name? It's gotten super popular. But anyway, I'm sure that everybody who listens to this will be like, oh, he's talking about that. But you give people that make up to a certain wage or a certain salary normally, and say, hey, we're just going to give you a supplemental $500 or $1,000. You'll be able to spend it on whatever, but it's something that you can, hopefully put towards the things which you need in life. And that is to help offset the fact that different technologies, naturally are going to disrupt certain jobs and careers. And, it may take 6 months or a year or a couple other years for new jobs to materialize and replace the ones that were lost. So I just think that that's another important factor, people to consider when they want to talk about, this is going to get rid of jobs and whatnot. But it also creates other opportunities, opens up other conversations, and allows us to try out different things.
Yeah.
We don't have to be stuck.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't find the number I was looking for because I can't remember what the article was now. I'm going to have to see if I can go back and find it later. But I vaguely remember when I was doing my speeches back in high school, which was 4 years ago, that there were about 70 million, I want to say. It was either 70 million or 70 billion. I think it was 70 million. Yeah, that sounds about right, because there's not 70 billion people in the world. There are 70 million jobs available in the United States just for agriculture alone. And so whenever people want to say, like, agricultural evolution is going to take away jobs, it's like, we have a ton of jobs that nobody is taking. We need to evolve. There's this concern that mechanized agriculture, or automated agriculture, which is the newest revolution of agriculture. Automated like milkers, and we have robots that'll actually check on cows for us, and we have drones that can do flyovers, and we have machines that can hand pick fruit for us now, and all that kind of stuff. Like, people always complain like, well, that's going to take away so many jobs from from immigrants and from other low income workers that need a steady job. It's like, well, they weren't taking them before. Like we invented that because we had no one working there. Like we need people working there, and nobody's taking the job because agricultural jobs aren't really pushed anymore. Like high school dropouts or people who go to college that don't know what they want to do. There's tons of career opportunities in agriculture that nobody looks at. And not going to say that milking cows all day is a glorious life, because it's definitely not. But if it'll get you through college, it'll get you through college. Or if it'll keep you busy until you can find something better, then do that. Like there's so many opportunities available, and not just in agricultural like food production, but actually like in the sciences, in computer development, in technology, in law. Like there's so many different jobs available in agriculture that aren't being occupied. It's no wonder we're having to evolve technologically, and especially because we have a lot of people to feed and not a lot of resources to do it. And so like to your point, as technology evolves, we're going to see changes in the job market that aren't necessarily a bad thing. And this kind of ties back to the whole lab grown meat thing that I was talking about, and like vertical farming, and like these are all like newer methods of agriculture that we're trying to see if they work before it's too late. Like people are saying like, why do we have to try GMOs? Because we don't need more food right now. We're already wasting all this food, like we talked about. Why should we be growing more than we need? It's like, because if we don't test it now and we test it when we need to and it doesn't work, we're screwed. We need to figure this out right now. And like I think as you explain that to people, they start to understand it, but that's not something that's necessarily common sense for most people. Which I mean, I'm not going to blame them for not knowing that, because who thinks about food all day besides me? But it's just it's just something that you have to keep in mind. And I kind of I've talked to some people who are from agricultural sectors that don't really understand. I've talked to people who are even more right wing that typically agree with me on some of this kind of stuff. They're just like, that's why are you worried about that kind of stuff? It's like, because if we don't worry about it now, it's going to be a big issue in the future. Like everyone needs to be worrying about this right now. And so I think that the technological advancements that we're making with, being able to grow food on other planets and other, on the moon or in the solar system, like however we develop new agricultural production methods, it's going to be a good thing. It may not be the new thing, but it's going to be beneficial no matter what, because it's going to give us more. Like I'm all for technological advancement as long as it means that we're going to continue to live a little bit longer. Like I don't think we're ever going to completely replace agriculture until Earth dies, because that's just how our planet works. But if we have to expand it to other planets, or if we have to produce more methods to grow that kind of stuff, or if we have to find alternatives to be able to handle all the regulations and the the urban sprawl, I'm fine with that, because that means that we get to keep living a little bit longer. We get to have food for a few more decades, hopefully, or a few more centuries before we finally blow up.
Right, before we before all the trade-offs become unmanageable.
Right.
Tip over the edge in one way or the other.
Right, and that's kind of, I mean, like I could go on forever on a million different things that have to do with this conversation, just because agriculture is ever expansive and there's so many different topics. But that's kind of what the new thing is in agriculture right now, is trying to find ways to make the trade-offs not so drastic, so that they don't hit us really hard at the end of the day. Like right now we're experimenting a lot with regenerative agriculture, which is methods of agriculture that have to do with preserving soil health and preserving the environment that benefits the crop crop health and crop productivity. And it's it's using genetic modification in some instances. Sometimes it's not, but most of the time it is. But it's actually lowering the amount of pesticides and herbicides we have to use. It's lowering the amount of tillage we have to do. Like some of these methods are being used, and they may not be productive right now, but once we figured out how to get them working and make them productive, it's going to make us be able to hold on to our land for a lot longer and not have to have that, like we talked about, the trade-off where we kill the land right now for some good yields and a lot of money, and then we don't have it for later. Like this way we can hold on to it, and the yield will come in time. We just need to be patient with it. And a lot of agriculturalists are kind of on the fence about this kind of stuff, but the ones that are trying it are seeing very, very good results. And so I think that we're going to start seeing that kind of stuff expand too. But that's a whole other topic we can get into. I know that I'm sure that you've got other things to do, so I don't want to take up too much more of your time.
Oh no, it's good. I mean, the thing is, I'm not even pressed for time, but that's actually all the different points that I had.
Yeah.
No, yeah, so I definitely enjoyed it, and it's amazing as you said, all these different, sides to it, and how long it takes to accumulate this understanding of this as it continues to grow and develop and splinter and branch off into these different arenas. And it feels like it's just something like a lot of different areas of life that's always just out of reach. Like you never really reach a final point, full comprehensive understanding or grasp of which way to go or what calls to make. It's more of just like, we never know what the next big thing is going to be, but we have to constantly be pushing and testing out stuff and researching and whatnot, and just kind of take the results as they come.
Yeah.
But that like you said, that main thing across the board is getting people, whether it's on the side of whether it's being on the side of being a producer or a consumer or some other mediating force, is thinking beyond tomorrow and thinking beyond our immediate needs. A lot of people have a hard enough time thinking what they're going to do in the next 2 or 3 days, let alone how they're going to be living their life in 10, 20 years. Even though if you ask most people, they'll be like, if you ask them, oh, do you expect to be alive, or do you want to be alive and living on this world in 10 to 20 years? And most people will say yes. Who has a damn 10, 20-year plan? Not even most governments or corporations plan that far ahead.
Yep. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And that's kind of the unique situation that agriculture is in, is that we're constantly having to plan ahead, because if we don't, we're going to find ourselves in a very, very bad place very quickly. Like, agriculture is one of the few industries, and like, companies plan, like you said, 5, 10 years ahead at times, but like, how many industries are having to plan so far ahead that they are prepared for any potential outcome, and even then they're not prepared for everything. Like, that's something that you can't account for. There's so many different factors, and agriculture, if anyone listening to this hasn't gathered this yet, agriculture is ever expanding, and it's so diverse with how many different things going on in it. Like, somebody who's an expert in one aspect of agriculture can't know everything about everything else about agriculture. I mean, like, I did research for my speaking competitions. I started when I was a junior in high school. I had to research for about 4 to 6 hours every day for 3 months before doing my first contest, and then I would do it probably another 2 or 3 hours every couple of days for another month or two before my next contest, and then another month of that for another contest. I did that contest for 3 years, and now I'm coaching it, so I'm doing it still. So for the past 4 or 5 years, I've been doing research continuously, trying to expand my knowledge, and it changes. I'm like, the numbers I gave in my speeches 5 years ago are not the same numbers that are consistent with today's statistics. Like, these numbers are changing constantly, and the information and the technology, everything about it's changing constantly. And like I couldn't give the same speech I gave when I was a junior in high school today and it'd be accurate. That stuff changes all the time. So like, the amount of stuff that's constantly changing with all of this is just, it's going to play a role in how much we are able to understand about our food systems. And so like, I may think I know a lot about agriculture. I like to pride myself in saying I know an okay amount of agriculture. I by no means have all the answers, and I do my research. There's farmers who do way more research than I do, that know way more than I do, and even they know nothing. Like, there's researchers that think they have the answers, and they haven't even figured it out yet, because every time we try something, if it works, great, we do it again. If it doesn't, we go back to the drawing board and try to figure it out, just like every other profession, science, art, practice, whatever you want to call it. Agriculture is constantly trial and error, because that's just how we have to be, and that's one thing I always try to say on this podcast, is like, I throw out a lot of numbers and a lot of statistics and a lot of information. I don't know everything. I know that what I researched is concrete information, but if you don't trust what I say, go look it up and prove me wrong. I'm more than welcome to admit that I'm wrong if you can find the stuff to prove me wrong. But that's just how it is. I mean, that's like, you can't have the answers to this stuff. You just got to kind of hope that things work out, and keep having conversations like we're having, and hope that something productive comes out of it.
No, 100%, man. I agree with everything you just said. We all, more conversations, more, exchanging this information, and not, being so hostile to acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, or that maybe we made a misstep here, that we can improve our methodologies in this respect. Being able to have a more buffet style approach, as opposed to having more of like a boutique, type approach, or a la carte, I guess is a better analogy.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I couldn't agree more. And like I mentioned, as much as there are a million and one other topics too that we could address, we did cover all the points on your list. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to talk about. If you had any more questions, if you had anything else you were curious about, I'm more than answering. Or if there's enough to make a whole separate episode, we might have to have a part 2 to this conversation.
No,
But yeah.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I'm definitely down to chop it up with you again. But that was everything, all the main issues I've been thinking about the last couple of weeks and whatnot since we first got into contact. And yeah, I feel like I was able to get out my points and learned a lot of things. You filled in a lot of blanks. So now I feel pretty good about this.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I'm definitely I'm in the same boat. I mean, I even learned some things, and that's always a productive conversation if both people learn something. So I think that's I think that we definitely end this with topics, and we came out with a better with even better of a conversation than I was expecting. So that's awesome. I'm glad that we were able to finally meet up and talk about all this. A million and one things had to get in the way first, but yeah, no, that's awesome. So yeah, I'm glad that we were able to do this. So yeah, thanks so much for joining me for this. It's sure been a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I have genuinely become a fan of the podcast, and my curiosity reaches leaps and bounds in every direction, and I'm so glad to continue down this path of understanding more about food and agriculture, and still remaining passionate about it, and still seeing that there are people who are equally engaged from it, and giving making their own contributions that are just as valuable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely appreciate, your support and the fact that you're a fan of the podcast and that you're interested in learning more about agriculture and expanding your knowledge, and that you're willing to have conversations about it and not just write it off as well. Somebody else will take care of that for me, but it's not important what I think. It's like, no, every time you go to the store and buy food, your choice matters. Like every time you vote on a regulation that's going to affect a farmer, your choice matters. Because at the end of the day, that's your food. You need to have a say in it. And so it really means a lot every time somebody tells me that they are either a fan of the podcast, or that they are interested in learning more about agriculture, or that they're an advocate for agriculture, whatever the case may be. It's always nice to hear that. So I'm glad that we were able to get to that phase. And as I mentioned, or as I offered everybody, if you have any other questions about agriculture that just come up, or you have an article that comes up, or you see a Facebook post, send it to me and just say like, hey, you have any information on this? What do you know about this? Can you answer anything? I'm more than happy to answer it as soon as I can on whatever it is. So if I don't know, I'll find somebody who does, and I'll get you the answer.
Hell yeah, man, I'm with
that. Awesome. So before we close, I do want to give you the chance to plug your podcast again and let everyone know where they could find you and listen to more of your cool thoughts.
I appreciate that. El Samboi, that's EL, and then Samboi, SAMBOI. I'm everywhere. I am the host of It's All Relative podcast, where I discuss everything from news to culture, politics, art, and media, while being an expert on none of the above. And and I really appreciate the time of you having me. What title do you prefer to go?
Did you catch it? Recorded in there. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's all good. I was just asking, what title do you prefer to go by, or what name do you usually use? Is it just Brendan, or?
It's just Brendan. Yeah, you can call me whatever you want. I mean, I answered pretty much anything, but yeah, Brendan's my name. My kind of like online name is Gambit for other reasons, but that's kind of, Brendan is what everyone calls me. So.
Okay. All right, no doubt. Well, hey, Brendan, I really appreciate you having me on. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm more than happy to have a part 2 where we discuss, even more angles and developments concerning food and agriculture.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much, Samboi, for joining me. It's sure been a pleasure. I'd be happy to have part 2. We'll have to discuss that. Find another time, probably in a few months, knowing how our schedules work. But yeah, we'll definitely get that worked out. So yeah, thanks so much. I hope everyone enjoyed listening to this, and everyone go check out Samboi. I'll have all of his links down in the description, so you guys can go find him and check out his stuff. But yeah, thank you again for joining me. Thanks to all my listeners for tuning in, and don't forget, if you ate today, thank a farmer.